So I felt like talking about Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty. Um, I just, I finished the game a few days ago and I really enjoyed it. Possible hot take, I thought it was better than the first Metal Gear Solid. And few things to tackle before I actually start talking about the game. So I already knew about the entire Raiden fiasco that happened with this game when this first released, and the twist of you playing as Raiden throughout the majority of the game. Now, given that I did not know the specifics of how long you play as Raiden for versus how long you play as Snake for, I knew that you play as Snake for the tanker mission and then after that you start playing as Raiden, but I did not know anything else about the game, about the story in particular, or how it shapes up towards the end. So that's about all the knowledge I had before going into the game, and as much as I would have liked to avoid that, I feel like being online these days and enjoying like video game conversations on the internet, I think that is something that was pretty much inevitable to avoid given how massive it is in terms of the conversation regarding bait and switch moves or twists in video game plots. So take that as you will when I talk about the rest of this game. So I think that does play into a lot about my feelings for this game because I knew about this major twist that kind of sours a lot of people's tastes about this game when they first played it. So yeah, that entire feeling of being shortchanged by not playing as Snake in the game in like a much anticipated sequel after the first Metal Gear Solid, that was pretty much a non-existent factor for me when I talk about this game and my feelings for it. Um, I want to start off with controls because I feel like that was the biggest gripe I had with the first Metal Gear Solid, and it's what held back my enjoyment for that game the most. And I think it's a pretty massive step up right from the start, right? I think given that there's only 3 years between the first Metal Gear Solid and this game, it's kind of crazy how much the graphics have improved. And in hindsight, I know that there was a console generation between this, and I think the graphics for this game look pretty damn good. Like, I wouldn't say they look as good as contemporary games today, but I could definitely see this as being passed off for a PS3 game, and I would not bat an eye at that. And yeah, given that this was an early PS2 game, I think that's a pretty big achievement. And yeah, coming back to the controls, I feel like the way that the controls have evolved from the first game to this game feels extremely instinctive, and the biggest game changer in everything is being able to shoot your tranquilizer or any other gun in first person. I think that completely changes the way in which I played this game and the amount of fun that I was able to have with this game. Where in the first game, at least in the start, I had to battle a lot with the idea that I shouldn't be engaging these enemies, especially given how hard it was to kind of sneak up behind enemies and put them in a chokehold. And most of the times when I tried doing that at the start, I would just end up, doing the over the head toss on the enemies, and that was pretty frustrating for me, to the point where I eventually evolved to just avoiding enemies wherever I could, and that was probably the optimal way of playing that game. I think in this game, because of the fact that you can use the first person mode and you can aim down the sights of your gun, I think it evolves a lot more avenues to explore within the game itself, and it increases that combat sandbox of being able to really explore the ways in which you can explore the stealth in this game. Along with that, I think a lot of the controls that were a little bit weird or tough to get adjusted to in the first game do carry over to this, just in terms of the button mappings. But I feel like it's a pretty valid evolution from the first game, which makes me feel at home right from the start because I jumped into this pretty much straight after I finished the first Metal Gear Solid. And yeah, it felt comfortable while being meaningful improvements that allowed me to enjoy the combat sandbox much, much more than I did in the first game. Um, More than that, now because I had an idea also of kind of where the first game was at in terms of the things it was able to do with the technological capabilities at the time, I feel like I was also much better able to understand the evolution that happened in this game and grapple with the things that, like, I could see the things that would be implemented in this game. And I think the game also does a pretty good job of flag posting those things. For example, uh, the mechanic that enemies can see your shadow and that you can also spot them using their shadow. I think that's really well implemented in the game straight from the tanker mission, and I think it does a very good job of showing things like that. And like the multi-layer structure of some of the levels, including the tanker, also establishes that like enemies from above can also see you now and you can see enemies above you. So yeah, I think overall the tanker mission, I agree with a lot of the sentiments that exist on the internet. Level design wise is probably the most fun I had playing this game. And being able to play a snake at the start was, I think, a pretty exceptional introduction to the game. And I really, really enjoyed it straight from the get go. Basically, everything about it um, worked for me and felt like to me it solved all the problems that I had for the most part with the first Metal Gear Solid. Um, Jumping a little bit into the story beats, I think the Metal Gear universe is in a very interesting place where it's kind of grounded, but also it's a little, when the game was released, it was a little bit into the future. So there's some technological advancements that they take as basically as the status quo in the game going forward, which I find is really interesting. And I think there's a lot of things that happen in the game that don't necessarily have like a predefined kind of origin. For instance, like the point that I'm extrapolating off of here is the fact that Ocelot now has Liquid's arm, and the arm just kind of takes over him the first time Snake appears in front of him in the tanker. I think things like that, which Metal Gear does, are very, very interesting to me, and I think also add a lot to the world of this game because as the player, it feels a lot like there are certain supernatural things happening around you, and because of these precedences that the game sets, it keeps you on your toes with respect to knowing that certain wacky and weird over the top things can happen and you don't necessarily know how or why they happen. And I think because of the overall tone of the games and the series, I think this strategy kind of lends itself very well to the overall structure and storyline of the game because it keeps you questioning of what is reality and what is not, and how the way you perceive things change over time. And I think that plays a lot into the themes of Metal Gear Solid itself, which really hammer a lot of these points home in the back end of the story, which I'll get to a little bit more. Um, Talking about the protagonist switch to Raiden, I think my thoughts on Raiden are generally positive in the sense that because I knew the switch was going to happen, I was expecting it, and I think many of the analyses I've seen and a lot of thought that I've also put into Metal Gear Solid 2, a lot of Raiden's character is the way it is because of the story that Metal Gear Solid 2 is trying to tell, and I really respect it for that. I think by no means, I don't think there's any parameter in which I would say that Raiden is a better protagonist than Snake, but I think he is the perfect antithesis to Snake that serves as the ideal vessel to experience the story that Metal Gear Solid 2 is trying to tell. And in that sense, I think he is pretty much the perfect protagonist for this game. He is everything that Snake isn't, in a way that is also different from what Liquid was in the first game. But I think the game does a really good job over time of justifying why this character swap was necessary, especially in the story beats that show up towards the end of the game. Um, I did think while I was playing the game that Raiden was a pretty cranky character, and but at the same time I feel like given how digitization has taken place over time, even more to the point in 2025, which is the lens from which I view this game, where everything digital has happened, I feel like it only increases the validity of him as a character in the game, where a lot of the things about him being trained through VR, and at the beginning it is imposed that he does not have a lot of real field experience. I think a lot of those stand much more true, which is another like prophetic part about this game. Like, people talk about it all the time about how well it predicted the future and the way the digital age was going to progress. But I think having that knowledge and information on my side, given that I'm playing this game many years after it originally released, I think it adds even more perspective and even more importance to the character of Raiden, which makes him an even better vessel to viewing, or to, yeah, basically experiencing the story that the team wanted to tell through this game. Um, I think another thing that I wanted to talk about was the existing of Snake throughout this entire narrative. I've heard a lot of people complain about the fact that even though Snake is on the scene, you're still playing as Raiden, which kind of leads even more to that frustration of why couldn't we just be playing as Snake this entire time. And I know a lot of that is resolved through the plot points at the end of the game, where it's all about making that new Solid Snake and the S3 program, etc. But I feel like the fact that Snake is still in the game and exists as that kind of the support character who basically gives you more intel and information as and when you need it, basically the character that fills in that 141.80 frequency, being Miller in the first game and now Snake, I think was a choice that made the playing of Raiden much better for me, because it gives you kind of that third person perspective towards the legend of Solid Snake that does exist in the world. And I think it's to the benefit of the game that you're able to have Snake around and look at him as not the protagonist and a character who is kind of like a ghost, and you hear people talk about him using the cardboard box to move around. And I think those little drops of information increase his kind of status as a legend for me even more when I'm playing the game, because me as a protagonist, I do a lot of stupid things, especially while grappling with the controls of this game, which kind of don't lend itself very good to Snake's legend status. But I feel like being able to see that from a third person perspective really did solidify that even more. um so yeah, I really did enjoy Snake as a character in this game, even though he was not the protagonist. Going a little bit towards the story beats at the end, and another thing I wanted to talk about before the meat of the plot is I really enjoyed the way that the similarities to Metal Gear Solid 1 that this game had were actually included into the plot line and basically what was happening in the game. Because I remember when I started it out and you finally switch and start playing the shell mission or the plant mission with Raiden, and you do the initial infiltration, and then it's like the only way up is the elevator at the back, and like all of those moments that mirror what Metal Gear Solid 1 was as homages to the original game, respecting the fans and kind of giving you that giddy feeling of this is all familiar to me and they're incorporating in a really good way, is elevated to an entirely new level when you find out that the entire Big Shell facility was the simulation of the Shadow Moses incident, and it kind of brings in that plot point to justify all the sort of homages and the little Easter eggs that exist referring back to Metal Gear Solid 1. And I really enjoyed that when that plot twist happened and that clicked in my brain. It made a lot of sense to me, and it also furthered the storyline in a very effective way that I really enjoyed. I do think a lot of the story is very back heavy in this game, but I didn't really mind that because I feel like the middle chunk of the game, which is exploring the shell, while it does become slightly tedious over time, I feel like I was figuring out more and more ways to get through it eventually. Like, especially in the beginning, I dreaded going through the areas where the drones existed because I didn't really put it together that you could destroy the drones if you hit them in the right place. I feel like at the start I did use the gun to hit them, and I must have missed because it didn't destroy the drone. And so I really thought those were a pain, but eventually when I had to cross the bridge and I was trying to disable the sensors over there and I destroyed the drone for the first time using the sniper rifle, then it clicked for me that moving around the shell I could have also done that. And I also found the tranquilizer gun really late in the game, and well, not really late, but when you actually have to go to the warehouse, I forget which item you have to drag back to get, but when I finally found the MK22 over there, it really changed the way I was approaching the game, similar to, and then it became similar to how I was playing the game when I played it in the tanker mission when you had the trank gun from the start. So I think there are good evolutions in the gameplay loop that are happening over that period of time, which tell their own story. And the smaller scale stories, for instance, the one that you have with Fat Man and Stillman, those kept me fed well enough and kept increasing that mystery of what is really happening here. Another thing that happened was when the cyborg ninja showed up for the first time and he looked the exact same. That's when my suspicions started to increase a little bit about these don't seem like just homages but are playing like a lot of role in the actual plot, which made me kind of start double guessing the things that were actually happening. And I thought that sense of mystery and ambiguity is what lends itself really well in this entire game, which is why I think all the plot dumps at the back end of the game really work, because a lot of that mystery has been peppered throughout the entire playtime of the game till that point, along with exploring the gameplay sandbox, which for me was entertaining enough to keep me coming back to this game. And I think I finished this game in like 2 or 3 days just because I was enjoying playing it so much more than I think I enjoyed playing the first game, just in terms of the controls. Um, and also the fact that the game is only about 12 to 13 hours long, even though a lot of the story comes in the back end of the game, it doesn't feel like you had to toil for a really long time to get those kind of payoffs that really impact you in a way that result in you remembering this game and this experience as a masterpiece. So I think the plot at the end for me was also really good, and I've heard a lot of people complain about the convoluted nature of the Metal Gear Solid franchise and its plotline, but to me, a lot of the things like made a lot of sense. I feel like the first epiphany that kind of happens in this game, where kind of that mind blowing nature of the things happening, was the conversation with the president when you use the Nikita RPG to break into the room. I feel like that's where the game started really grabbing me in terms of the storyline and not just the gameplay sandbox. And I think I really enjoyed the meta nature of the story. I really enjoyed the way there's always twists and turns, and when you think it's finally done and maybe now you have a grasp of what's happening, they drop another bombshell which basically changes the entire landscape of the way you view the story. And I think it worked for me really well, and I did not feel the length of the cutscenes and the codec calls at the end because I was constantly mind blown with the things that were dropped on me. It kind of reminded me of watching Tenet, but if Tenet was like executed well. Where in Tenet, the entire time I was scratching my brain trying to understand what is going on, keeping up with the story, and like trying to make that kind of chronological order in my head of, okay, this led to this, and now we're here. I feel like even with all of its exposition and all of the additional incremental details that Metal Gear Solid 2 lays upon you, I think it does a really good job of keeping you engrossed in that story and kind of letting you track the evolution of all the twists and turns. Like, Ocelot's triple quadruple crossing of whoever's he's working with by the end. Like by the end, he ends up becoming Liquid Snake and going after the Patriots, who after the credits we realize are already have already been dead for over 100 years. So I think there's not a single point in the back end of this game where I felt bogged down or bored by the story. I feel like I was engaged by it the entire way through, and that's what made this game truly memorable and unlike any other gaming experience I've had. And even though my preference of story may be something else, I think this has a very special place in my heart as a video game story, as a narrative, as a very relevant topic and basically conversation, especially with how the digital age has evolved over time. And so, yeah, I think Metal Gear Solid 2 really nailed all of its themes for me. It was pretty much a perfect game to the extent where now I have jumped into Snake Eater, but before that I was very iffy about whether I should jump directly into Snake Eater, because I feel like Metal Gear Solid 2 left such a deep impact on me in terms of all of its twists and turns and the amount of YouTube videos I've watched about different people's interpretations of what happened, and the amount of kind of thinking I've done about the plot and rewatching of the codec calls and the cutscenes to kind of piece together all the different things that happened in the story and why they are so relevant even in today's age. I felt like no matter what Snake Eater did, it would be extremely difficult to top that for me. And I will talk about how I feel about that game in my probably next video eventually. But yeah, I thought Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty was an absolute masterpiece. I thought it improved the first game in terms of its formula, in terms of its story, in terms of how you feel while playing it. And I think it really advanced all the stealth mechanics and all the engagements with the sandbox in its entire duration. And I really struggle to find any problems that I do have with this game, except for some extremely minor pacing issues that I did not even feel because of the length of this game and how long, expansive and bogged down a lot of AAA games have become today. So I think, yeah, Metal Gear Solid 2 easily finds its spot in my top 10 games of all time, probably pushing top 5, and I think it really changed the way that I viewed the Metal Gear series, and it made me understand all the hype behind the Metal Gear series, which definitely happened with the first one too, but this was able to do that without most of the gameplay frustrations that I had with the first game. And that's why I think for now, of the two I've played, Metal Gear Solid 2 is my favorite Metal Gear game. But that's all for now. Peace.